get a sense of what this concert is, what animates your music and your concert, please welcome Alan Mearns. So one connection with the recital tonight actually is that Howe is playing one half of repertoire that really showcases the classical guitar's kind of solo output, a piece by Barclay, a Casanova Tedesco piece. And then the other side of her recital is what the guitar has perhaps always been used for, which is accompanying the voice, creating a kind of an atmosphere that almost makes it sound like the guitar was conceived with the voice in mind.
Yeah.
What is your guitar? Because I don't think that is really your repertoire, but you are a singer-songwriter.
Yeah, I do my own songs. I play Irish music and sing that stuff, and I do my own folk songs. Had a rock and roll band for a while. But yeah, with the classical guitar, I guess they kind of like delineate what kind of guitar it is, or how I think about it. Or
how do you think about it? You've mentioned a technological harp.
Yeah, there you go.
What is a technological harp?
Well, a technological, it's when you have like the realization, sometimes when you grow up playing an instrument and you're fretting the notes and you're playing all these things, you're thinking like, oh, when I touch here and this note happens. But when you look at it, obviously we all know you're creating a short string, right? And the frets basically are like a miniature nut, right? And so every time we create a presentation on the guitar, no matter what it is, it's a set of open strings, basically. But your hand becomes part of the technology, just like the hammers, etc. inside this machine do a lot of the work, right? And then you just fall on it and it's like a perfect note, right? My son's a pianist, I always make fun of him. It's like, boom, perfect note. The guitar, is so difficult, right? Because you are the technology. You're creating this new little string, but also plays into this idea that the guitar has this ancient quality that I would describe it as a technological harp. It's a portable harp. And we can create this, like Orphean accompaniment that goes back beyond the mists of time, right? And we can access that, and it's portable, and it's poetic. Obviously, Schubert wrote a lot of his songs on the guitar. So, but the strangeness of the guitar, I find, in terms of its harp-like quality, is the strange sonorities that it has when the strings kind of coincide and over-ring with each other, because the notes die so quickly that it's very rarely unpleasant, as opposed to just holding the pedal down on the piano and it'd be a bit of a mess, right? But the guitar has this kind of, almost kind of strange esoteric quality when you hear these notes played against each other, much like we experience in a lot of Leo Brauer's pieces, or even when you hear like Leanda, on the over-ringing, and there's a great mystery there to me that is unfathomable and always interesting. So the basic idea.
Yeah, the guitar can be a much more of a single-line instrument that way, can't it?
Yes, an engaging single-line instrument, absolutely. Because absolutely.
So you're connecting, you mentioned the guitar as kind of like having an atmosphere of something ancient to it.
Absolutely.
When played in this way.
Almost occultic. It's such a strange thing. It's very difficult to understand. That's why it's so difficult to write for it well, Mm-hmm. And partly my even approach in trying to arrange pieces that I love is I almost have this, obviously there are people who can write really well for the guitar, but maybe the best that we've heard is Villalobos, Leo Brauer, who understand the guitar, understand these strange esoteric qualities, and perhaps maybe some of the best guitar music wasn't originally written for guitar. You know, a lot of these iconic pieces that draw people to the classical guitar were originally perhaps, you know, Bach wrote them for a solo instrument, or some Albanoth or something. So I find myself thinking sometimes maybe it's easier, if you want good guitar music, find a great composer and just tell them to write a piece of music and then I'll arrange it for guitar. Is there something kind of hampering about maybe writing for the guitar? It's very difficult because it's so strange, you know, and so only really someone who can unlock it. So sometimes you can make arrangements that become really good guitar pieces if they're done well.
Yeah, even in a piece like Asturias, which you have your own version of.
Yeah.
If I remember rightly, for the guitar here.
Yeah.
You're just going to have to remind me of what exactly you do, but we have the harp right away, so everybody knows this. And there's. But when you get to this stuff, don't you also?
Do I do? Yeah. Yeah, I do that. Yeah.
So you actually use harp fingerings within the harp.
Yeah, I think of that piece. Yeah, exactly. Is very much kind of going into something, not just to do with time, as in rubato and time of the piece, but to me, you know, Asturias or Land or whatever you call it, is this study in going into ancient time and a kind of a clash of civilizations, you know, in that kind of Andalusia area. So you get that kind of the Moorish stuff and the Arabic harp that kind of comes in like a ghost, you know, and then you have these kind of Christian triadic things that counteract against that. And so to me that exists in that piece, and even though in the piano it's like written as staccato, you know, obviously the piano is imitating a guitar. So I kind of ignore that literal staccato thing and I lean into the guitars, you know, those over-ringing qualities toward just to heighten anything I can. But not that's just an instinctual thing though too. It's not like I'm kind of cognitively doing that. Or,
right.
You know.
So it's a little bit like you have this poetic feel in the music,
exactly.
And then you say, why am I feeling that?
Yeah.
And then you start to think, well, what about the Moorish history and...
Well, it's the way Stanley does the B section. My teacher, Stanley Yates. Like, let me show you real quick if I can. Usually we hear this kind of thing, right? Which is fine and beautiful. But Stanley arranged it kind of like this, like. And then it becomes something different, right? You know. And it's like there's air happening. You know, you get these similar resonances that the piano can afford, and the harp obviously has. But there's an evocation occurs in the guitar. To me, it's like without getting too woo-woo about it, it's just this feeling that it becomes a metaphysical thing, it becomes a strange thing. And I very much feel like that, obviously, with Albanoth's and some of Granados' music. In fact, I've got this little poetic idea, a little poem that says something along the lines of Granados and Albanoth conceived their guitar music in secret and left it swaddled at the door to be raised by the piano. You know, like, because the guitar was too, you know, of the bordellos and the, you know, the alleyways and the people, the sweat and the tears, the duende, you know. So I think there's an element of truth in that, you know, but perhaps some of the best guitar music wouldn't have been written if it wasn't. You know, so for my son, who's a very talented composer, he wrote, literally for Christmas, he wrote me these amazing pieces, just called Magi, you know, like the three Magi, Balthazar, Gaspar. They've got these cool musical names. And there's these very ethereal pieces, but I just told, just write piano pieces, and then we'll deal with it later, because I wanted his imagination to be emancipated. and him to hear the harmonies and the things that because he thinks on the piano, and he's got Chopin and Prokofiev and Bach in his fingers, so. And then a lot of times with the guitar, even if it's reduced a little bit, a lot of times like the answer comes. There's this mysterious answer. So I've done that with the first of his pieces, and it just involved tuning the 6th string up to F. And then it was like, oh, here we go, it's on. So I have that a bit of a strange relationship with the guitar, where it's part an intellectual thing, part problem solving, maybe a bit of a chess match, and then partly just a kind of an inspirational, like the guitar has answers for me, and it's telling me, hey, see this piece, do this piece, the guitar itself or whatever is behind everything, and some of the pieces have their own answer where you wouldn't think that it's possible.
So then I have a question on that. When you get to that sort of idea that, tune it to F and there it is, that just came in your head and you began to play it, or you played around with some different
I probably played and improvised with it and tried different things, and then there was probably a logical conclusion. Sometimes it's an issue of just logic, as Steve will tell you. He's arranged all of Chopin's mazurkas for the guitar very well. But so for instance, with the famous, you want to maybe play that raindrop?
Yeah, I was going to come to that actually, yes.
Yeah, so a lot of times you're waiting for kind of an answer, you're circling it, a piece that's a problem to be solved in a way, and you're kind of like, as my wife said, I was showing her this little Mumpo piece, which was very beautiful to me, just sitting on the porch, having a whiskey and a cigar. And she was like, do you have designs on this piece? And I was like, what you just said is exactly what it's like. It's a bit of a romance so it's usually like a piece that I really love, and I just want to be with it. Similarly, pianists do this too.
So there's time involved though.
There's time, yeah. Sometimes, sometimes you're circling something for a while, and you have kind of, so when I get done with a few concerts, and I'm not concentrating on just the physical kind of nature of playing things. I have a list of these pieces that are just in the bag that I'll be getting stuck into. Like for instance, the famous Foray Pavane. I've kind of figured that out in a oversight way. The first Opus 9 Chopin Nocturne, the very first one. Kind of got that figured out in a macro way, and then the rest is like just getting into the details, and then it becomes a really fun thing because you get the big problems solved. If you get the tuning issue or the whatever the open strings are required, and then the rest is kind of gravy, because then you get into these beautiful fingerings that create the sonority that Stanley did with that little thing that makes it different, and makes it kind of alive,
Let's listen to.
There's a real recording
Oh,
of it.
sorry, it's not the real recording.
That's just me in the living room with my dog snoring in the background.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Okay.
It's kind of.
Okay, if I just search for the word raindrop.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for your patience. So, where she blows. Stop it whenever you say something.
The only thing I want to do is change the view.
Okay.
Otherwise, it'll be a weird mix of that, my wife's climbing videos, and my Italian language study, all kind of, and the chess. So let's just small focus. that's a piece originally in D flat major on the
Yeah.
piano, and often I think transcribed in D or A.
Yeah, usually guitarists, whatever the key name is, they can do that.
And it's definitely one of these pieces where in the original, the piano just seems to breathe freely.
Yeah.
You've got
It
the white
floats.
keys, you've got the black keys, and that 1A flat. Dun dun dee dun
Yeah.
dun dun dun. In your version, that pitch in your version is just kind of there in the middle of the black keys and just coming back.
Yeah.
And D flat major is a very special key for Chopin,
For sure.
right?
Yeah.
We were talking about that a bit earlier.
Yeah.
So why E major?
Well, for this piece, obviously it's kind of a problem to be solved, because when you're doing any piano piece on the guitar, there's very few options with the key. You can't just do it willy-nilly. On a logical level, which is very bizarre, because I've seen a lot of arrangements and they don't do this, that repeated note, to me, in the start of the negotiations, it's like, well, that has to be an open string. You know, are you kidding me? You know, the entire piece, I'm not going to use an open string. So logically, and I'm thinking of the tessitura of the guitar, where's it going to sing? The piano's a little higher. It'll bring it into the guitar's kind of chanterelle, first string voice, where's the la da da, you know. Well, it's not going to be the open E string, you know, and then the B, it's kind of constantly kind of a fifth, right? And so the key of E becomes kind of self-evident until the other section where there's another problem arises, where it comes to this big giant chord.
Shall we look at that?
Yeah. And then because it comes to this, it goes to the parallel minor key, E minor, but then it kind of reaches a climax in its 3 chord, like a giant, which in my key would have to be a big G chord with a higher D that's beyond this, and I don't want this unless I, you know, so I tuned the A string down to G. Bada bing, bada boom. Bob's your uncle.
Sorry.
That's it, this one.
Yeah, right, yes. Okay.
So we're going into the parallel minor. So that part has to be big and idiomatic to me, or the negotiations aren't working, and I would have to
Great effect.
not do it, you know.
You chose E major only because you wanted the fifth to be the open D.
Well, I wanted some string a certain pitch, height, you know, it can't just be any open string, you know, or it's not going to have this kind of like middle. That's like the B under middle C, right? Literally. So it just has to kind of float in the middle of between the singing voice and then the other stuff. So yeah, to me that was the only, yeah.
Right, because without it, so your premise is something like this. You've got this, basically,
Exactly.
a lot of this is in the piece, right? And then you've got this.
The Schenkerian sense. This is the piece.
And you've got these.
Yeah, exactly. In
But
the kind of
then-
Fernando Sor work.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's all fine until suddenly
Yeah, but
either that or.
yeah, a very
So that's
Yeah,
no good. So
uneventful.
therefore. And then you're.
exactly. Yeah,
idea.
and then it goes to the 3 chord stranger there. It's like Chopin's always.
Oh yeah. So,
Something, yeah.
how was that thing?
Then you even have the open for that
Exactly.
occasional. Yeah.
Right. So the D and the B. So in fact, all of these
Works.
strings are all kind of participating, making the piece breathe.
It's like, yeah, the guitar is whispering to you. It's like, let me show you, do this. But I find with a lot of romantic music, I remember talking to Steve Aaron about this, that it has kind of more of a tertiary relationships, right, as opposed to...
This is the biggest challenge in the music of Chopin. He always goes to a key a third away.
Yeah, says Schubert as well.
It's always in a key that doesn't work compared to the other key that you chose.
Exactly.
So this is perfect. You have a piece in the key of E,
Yeah.
and a string is tuned to G.
Yeah, so
it's like the most counterintuitive thing.
for a lot of these pieces, that's the norm for me. It's like
Yeah.
become a new kind of tuning, and like the Russian guitar, right? It's a big G chord, and so you kind of have this just G chord. I know
Oh, yeah, sorry, I reached
so
it.
right.
There's another thing, if I can mention,
Yeah.
which is that in those developmental contrasting sections in the pieces, you don't want to sound like you're working the hardest there.
No.
You want it to feel comfortable and elegant on the instrument.
This is one of the
typically, the
yeah.
arrangement's always like you're working in hard.
All these artificial harmonics. And
Yeah.
this is the real. I think this is like a base level kind of macro problem I would see with guitar arranging, maybe historically, is that very issue, and the issue that we talked about earlier about just finding an idiomatic answer. The guitar. My son started playing piano during the COVID lockdown, just kind of bizarrely, in this really high level, and just started going in and he started composing. But when he had his first formal lesson with someone who was of the Russian school, the Moscow University, we're all Rubinstein, the Horowitz. This guy gives everyone a sheet of paper on the very first lesson. It has some scales and arpeggios, but it also has like the sheep and the goats, like the biblical thing. Like some notes are sheep, some notes are more important than others. And the goats, some of these notes aren't as important. Right on the very first lesson, like a hierarchy of, weight and gravity. And so you find a lot of people spending all this time over a few notes that really don't matter. It better reduce it to one note if Chopin was doing it and he understood the guitar. And you get the same effect, right? You get the same thing. So there's a lot of fussiness, I find, when people are stuck to the page as opposed to using their ear, and solving some of these issues and making a big deal out of things that aren't that important and turning it into a physical struggle. That's got to be like the fundamental difficulty, I find, It doesn't make it pleasant for the performer to play or the listener, you're just kind of like, come on, cheering for them to get through it.
It's very common to listen to a piece on the piano, say, typical source for our transcriptions, and think that would sound marvelous on the guitar. And then you get more and more excited, you keep listening to the piece, and then for most people the first actual official step of arranging it is then to get the score, which is often like a cold shower. Like immediately you see, oh my god, it actually goes to the flat submedian to this whole section, how's that going to work? And oh my god, in measure 4 there's already that beautiful low note. How do you overcome that particular issue? I think you have a particularly revolutionary approach to this.
Well, just use your ear?
Yes.
Yeah.
In other words, you don't actually step into the cold shower, right?
Yeah,
you stay
absolutely.
with the oral experience.
When I had to do when I was arranging the Chaconne and Stanley was pressing for me to write it all out so he could make it into an edition, I had to write it all out for like the first time, It was all occurring in my fingers and imagination. And so if a piece I know really well, and I learned to have a courage to do this from Stanley, really, you know, because I remember when I was studying with him, I was playing this Mozart fantasy, and Stanley's very contrarian and not competitive, but he's like very capable. So if somebody's like one of his students is, oh, who does he think he is with this he started arranging these amazing pieces, one of which I'll be playing on Saturday, La Vega, and he arranged this Rachmaninoff, the famous C sharp minor prelude, and he told me, he was like, well, yeah, I just tuned my guitar down a half step and did it by ear, D minor, just listened to it. And so, but there's this reality, it's a little bit like Robert Frost talks about with poetry, you know, the sound of sense. To hear the sound of sense, you want to listen through a closed door, and you'll hear people go, and you kind of hear the music of speech a little bit. And there's an element, I think, if you listen to, maybe there's a piano piece you really love, maybe turn it on your system and go into the kitchen and listen to it and ask yourself, what do I hear? You know, so there's a reality to that. And then I also gleaned a lot of just very sage things from Stanley in regards to that, like the music, the outer notes of music is where the focus is, right? So he's arranged Mozart's Magic Flute Overture in like 2 voices. It's like a soar piece. And if you get his edition concert piece, it's amazing. So when these whippersnappers played that, it would blow people's minds. It sounds exactly like it. It's just amazing arranged. But it's just 2 voices, right? It's the highest voice and the lowest voice. So we find in music is the peripheral thing is actually in the center, right? It's the opposite of our sight. And so if you're hearing those accurately, those things, and then you see what you can put in the middle, that is idiomatic to the guitar, you'll get like the effect of the piece, you know. So it's a bit like that kind of John Hume thing about the apple, you know. Is it an aesthetic thing? Is it in your brain, the taste of the apple, or is it in the apple itself? And when we're just like stuck on the score, it's kind of like staring at the apple. But it's here, you know. It's or isn't it Leonard Bernstein said about what is music? Music is the feeling the listener gets. He takes it even further, away from even notes, and it's the feeling of those notes, the effect of it. So if you can create the effect, and it may be even a different effect because it's being taken on by the guitar, and it may not be as big and overwhelming, but it may have another character that's maybe equally seductive or different, but valid. So,
shall we listen to another example of this?
I'm curious. So you transcribed Bach's Chaconne, and I'm curious whether you had.
Well, far from transcribed, I kind of like
arranged.
Yeah, I kind of did my own. Well, yeah. Do you want to talk about this?
Well, I was curious to know if previously you had, say, Segovia's version in your hands.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I played the Chaconne from when I was like 17 and played it. And even when I was a master's student, and what was funny is my teacher, Stanley, was trying to he had made this kind of arrangement in E minor, right? And I just played it for my juries and stuff, and he was like, oh, you should think about playing it and like this, like check this out. And he was just kind of trying to foist it on me. I just like to use the word foist. And it didn't make any sense because I already knew it, right? But then when I started to do this whole thing, I started doing this Bach recording, or the idea of doing it almost out of guilt, because I always felt like I kind of like wasted like my classical skills or something, and I wanted to do a recording for my teachers. You see, I did something, you know, and I had these Bach pieces kind of under my fingers, and I'd spent all this time pursuing like a rock and roll career and doing my songs and stuff, and then I had my own love of the classical guitar kind of rekindled on its own terms outside of the ivory tower. So I was at my in-laws' house just with my steel string guitar, and I actually had this dream, like this lucid dream of playing the chaconne in E minor. You know, just that opening kind of overture, and just seeing it in my dream, like so clearly. It was like this kind of William Blake, kind of this lucid dream, you know. And I woke up and I got my like Larrivee steel string guitar, and I was like, you know, just by ear, you know, I was kind of like, if you just start with that, it's like, you know, it's like, you know, and then you're in the realm of John Doland, and the guitar is an E minor chord. And so I was very excitedly emailed Stanley, and I was like, do you still have that arrangement in E minor, you know, for the chaconne? And he just sent it to me. And then I just started learning that with no idea of adding things or kind of extrapolating other counterpoint or anything. But then just things started to occur while I was learning it and messing around with it. And so my version of the chaconne grew out of that, largely because a lot of things are emancipated. Like if you think of just this versus this, all of a sudden things are accessible, and the way me and Stanley play, you know, you play a lot up here in the, you know, 9th position, 5th positions, and then I would reach for things. There would be these counterpoints that were maybe unusual because they were higher notes, you know, that you're adding. And so that just kind of organically happened. And then because of the nature of the form, you can kind of treat every, and I think this is how Bach wrote it or semi-improvised it. It's almost like you can hear him coming to the end of each variation, which becomes the next idea of a pair of variations, perhaps, you know. And so things would start to occur like that, and it just kind of grew in and of itself and became this kind of monstrosity that sounds like it's written for the Assad brothers or something. But it's...
I have a feeling we have a mixed audience where some people are very familiar with this and some people might not be. So should we listen to a little bit of this?
Sure, absolutely.
I wonder whether it would be interesting to listen to a little bit of the violin.
Sure, yeah.
Although how much time do we have? Not a lot, actually. Let's see.
So you just put the chaconne on, then we'll be good.
That's your recording up, just so people are reminded of how it is on the violin, which is actually huge on the violin.
Yeah.
Who's playing?
Alina Ibragimova. If I could just get to a little bit of like maybe where the quavers start.
Sure, yeah.
Probably round about here. Because it's around about here that we start to get this very monodic kind of writing without the chords. Gives an idea, doesn't it, of like the one of the violin. And what strikes me always about hearing that is the violin is being used to the full.
Yes. Yeah, it's being pushed to its limits.
And on the guitar, you have a very imaginative approach to creating actually the same overall impression.
Yeah.
that the guitar is being, well, that the instrument is resonating and working. Why doesn't that work actually? So I can't, oh, oops. So I have to go down a long way to do it to find your.
A wee bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Keep flicking.
So this will be right in there. It's one of these.
Dunville whiskey, Belfast. It's my wife. There's a theory that Bach wrote it after his wife died, and it's a kind of an elegy to.
So right when we come to those scales, we hear the harp
Yeah, yeah.
as well, the harp approach, and yet the harp seems to be there all the way through, even though you're
Yeah.
adding all of this stuff. And
Yeah, I have to. It's almost like a problem. It's like a recovering addict or something. It's like I'm not capable of going like. I have to go. You know, because I don't want it to die. I don't want to be choppy. You know, I want it to. So it's like the guitar is a miniature cathedral. You know, it's an acoustical space.
Wait. We were all supposed to know what you meant by that, and I just want to. Are you saying that you changed strings more often than necessary?
Yeah, I play
Is that what you're
across the
saying?
strings
Okay.
all the time.
Okay, that's what.
Because that's what, in terms of the technological harp.
Because if
thing,
you stay on the same string, then you have to
Is it
shut off the old note completely.
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
And then you have that autumnal dying
Yeah.
and the interplay of those. Sorry.
Your capo,
Yeah.
and I'm curious, what, you just found the resonance pleasing capoing it, or?
Yeah, well, originally I just done it without a capo, and it fit quite well. But then, well, you know, when I was younger, I would love to play John Dolan pieces, you know, and I would do that with a capo, and it just felt right. And so I put the capo on. I forget the reason. It wasn't any particular reason. It was just like, oh, this sounds better. It just sounds, it kind of enlivens the harmonics. And Stanley would claim, my teacher, that it almost becomes this kind of metaphysical Baroque guitar in a sense, even though we know there's a Baroque guitar
Mm.
that's more akin to a ukulele modern day. But
I feel like
so it's got this kind of
it sounds less like raw.
yeah.
When you have a capo on, do you
Yeah, it kind of like sings, it enlivens the harmonics. And then I had a very strange circumstance where I was listening, it was just kind of on the internet, and Gustav Leonhardt playing his arrangement of the chaconne
On the harpsichord.
on the harpsichord, and I was like, that sounds like the key I'm playing it in. Obviously not F sharp minor, you know, but obviously he was tuning like a Baroque temperament harpsichord in G minor. And so you find when Bach translated solo violin works, you know, like the second partita or sonata, sorry, he would, you know, move it down a fourth or a fifth, you know, into the tessitura of that instrument, you know. So it weirdly aligned the same literal key that Gustav Leonhardt was playing it in. And G minor is a very important key, you know, in Baroque music. I mean,
Oh, so he was in
common.
415 G minor.
exactly,
Okay,
exactly,
yeah.
which is equivalent of us playing an F sharp minor.
Yeah.
So it has the, you know, it's like the St. John's Passion key, you know. Obviously you've got the fiddle, it's got the G kind of 1 and 5 there. So, and it just seemed to lift it a little bit out of the doldrums on the guitar. The guitar is already a very dark instrument, and so I like to kind of slightly bring it into more of a vocal range, if I can, with a lot of pieces, and not get too. It gets very complex down there in terms of overtones. Especially, you know, you're attempting to play thirds or something. That's why sixths and tenths sound so good on the guitar. It's just a very dark instrument. You know, so this is like the bottom third of the piano, kind of. You know, so it's like very close to the cello, really. So I like to lift it out a little bit and bring it into. It'll have a little bit of a, almost this kind of primordial lute world. You know, the ancient regime or whatever you call it, right? This kind of otherness to it, an airiness to it, perhaps, you know. And the chaconne, as we know, is a form that came from the guitar, from the New World. And also I found out recently that Viet Bach, Bach's great-great-grandfather, who Bach traces as the first musical Bach, played the citern, which is kind of a guitar of sorts. You would know better than me.
Yeah.
You know, kind of an accompaniment guitar, double stringed, right? Double. And so, I'm always trying to find these links. But to me, that piece has always sounded. My initial encounter with the chaconne was from an orchestral violinist who made me listen when I first moved to America. He made me listen to this Christopher Parkening recording because he was completely dumbfounded by it. As a violinist, he was like, "This just sounds so good." Listen, you know, and I'd never encountered the chaconne, and I just listened to the whole thing, and it was just an amazing aesthetic experience, you know, an artistic experience. So, to me, the guitar, you know, is very natural with these kind of figures, and then it's just a matter of like, do I dare to fill it out a little bit? And most of what I'm doing is, you know, it's imitation. So I'm just playing things and trying them out. And this sounds better. And with the variation form, you know, you can do it in little pieces. But it started off when I was never convinced by how people did that major arpeggio section. But I started doing this thing, this kind of harpsichord-y kind of thing. And I was like, oh, yes, that was the first thing I did. But I was kind of scared to show Stanley, my teacher. I thought he might like punch me or something, but he was like, oh yeah, do more, you know, and I had these like, so he encouraged me to continue sinning, you know, but that's why it's kind of like Bach / Mearns. It's not to do with I'm trying to like elevate myself, obviously. It's more like, if there's anything screwed up about this, it's on me, you know. It's in taking responsibility for anything. It's like a musical sin. I'm sure there's many, but so yeah. That process is more creative as opposed to problem solving or reductive bringing a piano piece down into the guitar. This is more of an exploratory, kind of Baroque aesthetic, really, just things that would be normal. The Baroque, I mean, Gustav Leonhardt does this, or Robert Hill, and it's no big deal in the greater music world. People arrange the chaconne for, a cello and 2 violins all the time. It's not a big deal. But I think with the guitar, because of Segovia and that Paris concert, right? The chaconne is just this kind of like, central point of contact, right, for our legitimacy as a concert instrument. And so sometimes it gets people's heckles up a little bit if you mess with their original Segovia thing or whatever.
It's like that with a lot of guitar repertoire, where something has such enormous historical significance. Another piece would be Fayet's little tiny piece,
Right.
a little masterpiece and all of that, but it's still a small piece that could be played in so many different ways.
Absolutely.
But perhaps I feel like we must give people the first cello prelude as well.
Yeah,
before
sure.
Sure. And again, maybe we make the same comparison. This one to me is particularly striking because it's so often played on the guitar.
Yeah.
And at first sight, it's hardly a piece that sounds particularly thin, even if you just play the original, right?
For sure. Yeah.
And so we have. I think I might just get some sound. Sure. Wait. Sorry. I actually want the.
C major, you did the C major?
No, it's an A configuration
A,
with the capo and the 2nd fret. So Baroque C.
Yeah, okay.
Let's do here a little bit of the cello, I think.
Can you turn it louder?
No, I don't know how to. I need some. Videos, it didn't work, but. Sorry, that makes me look so stupid, but it was grayed out when I was trying to play the videos. So,
Right.
so I just assumed there was no way. And also I was told, you can't use audio video in any of your lectures. But then we saw that this and we thought we would hack into the system. All right. So here we go back to.
Just go back to the previous page.
I'm going to go all the way down.
It's just next to the chaconne.
Okay.
Yeah, near
Getting there.
Yeah.
Right here.
Those are Baroque gloves. Authentic.
People were poor back then, they couldn't afford the whole thing.
No. You'll be able to play the guitar.
Oh,
So why the the rhythmic bass. Tell us about that.
This dum dum dum.
Yeah, I
well,
saw your wonderful tapping foot even just now.
apparently Bach was very rhythmical. Yeah, there's a written record of him being bubbling over with rhythm.
Yeah.
But when I started doing that piece, I'd actually recorded the whole Bach record, and then I started working on this, and it was kind of reactionary, to be honest, at first, because I heard some recordings of it, and it was very kind of rhythmically noodly and like a fantasy. But I hear this piece as a very structured piece, almost like I hear it like it reminds me of some of the Brandenburg concertos and stuff, the nature of it. And I can't help hear some things kind of echoing. If Bach had the means, he would tease out these motifs and kind of and triangulate the harmony in a certain way.
So
yeah.
play a bit of
Yeah, there you go. Exactly like that. Dee-da-dun-dun, dee-da-dun-dun. Yeah, so that's exactly the kind of thing that I felt in a vague way. I just felt this vague Brandenburg-y type enlarged thing. And then when Bach writes for the cello and it just repeats something, I assume if he could tease it out, he would, and answer it and kind of echo it around a wee bit. But that driving quality, I just find in Baroque music, when you get into kind of Mozart, Haydn and stuff, it's almost like the downbeat is the leaving point. But in the Baroque music, it's like a point of arrival. Nearly always. You're the expert. I just defer to.
So many are dances, right?
Yeah. So the arrival of the
dance.
step, and there's a gesture towards. So there's yum bum ba yum bum. It's got this kind of infectious quality. But I just see it as a very structured piece, and I just kind of.
He also very often the phrase is finished on the beat.
Yeah, they arrive on the first beat as opposed to departing from the first beat, like.
Or both, as a cadential allusion.
Exactly. Right. There you go. But so that's what I don't know if that's why I did that driving, but I think it was just kind of an intuitive thing, and I like that. Just to bring another character into it. If you can on the guitar, you do what you can on the guitar, and you have the thumb and you have the finger. It's like what comes out of the guitar. If it's rewritten for the guitar or imagined, it's almost like I imagine it as arranging a piece that Bach, and I think of Bach as like his ambassador from the infinite. Like if he had the means, things would get even bigger than the Mass in B minor. If he had like a Villalobos choir, he would just keep going into eternity, and the music is so, triadically real as physics itself. It would just keep going and be bigger and bigger and like the size of a planet, So when I see him doing these solo works for the cello, it's kind of a miracle in a sense, but it's also, as Stanley says, it's kind of like a little bit like seeing a dog walk on two legs. You could imagine that he has that invention of an idea and he could easily extrapolate it into a trio sonata or a fully fledged keyboard piece, and it's more like a musical note, almost a form of notation. So when I see what the guitar can do, I'm like, well, let me try this, and I try it through my fingers, so it's not like overly cumbersome, perhaps. But it's difficult to play. But I've done that. I just recently finished the whole suite for guitar, so. I'm going to get Jonathan, he doesn't know this yet, but I'm going to get him to correct it.
Oh, correct.
Like get a big red pen out. No.
Well, I think a good example of what you're saying is when you took Vivaldi for violin.
Bach was completely a total European and a fan. You get any music, Marcello, a lot of things that are attributed to him. There's an amazing Marcello fugue that Bach slightly expounded upon in the fantasy, or what the.
Weiss, the composer, also here is a suite by Weiss.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, for a trio sonata.
Well, I had no idea. That's amazing. I
Is that
find
written for
Weiss.
lute originally?
Yeah, Baroque flute, yes.
Yeah, I find Weiss's music very compelling. I'll be playing some Weiss in my concert. But yeah, so yeah, Bach we just absorb, and he was just a music fan. So that's also another kind of argument for the arrangement thing, is that we treat these composers and the written score almost like this deified way, and it kind of becomes statued, like in this statued form, but the music is alive, and it's like there's something that came to them, that is even bigger than what they wrote on that score, so there's the capital M music, shall we say, that if you could tap into something, there's still a kind of a turbine that's humming, that's alive, that if you're lucky, that maybe you can tap into something that was there at its inception, because the music itself, the reality of music that occurred to them at that time. But I also find, in these pieces that are smaller, that I don't think Bach wrote them in this romantic sense, like a Stravinsky wrote a solo violin piece. That's what it should be, Music was a little bit of a different thing back then, and interchangeable, and you use whatever you have, to make it come alive. So, if that makes any sense.
It's interesting, I keep coming back in my mind to your harp approach, because we read that whenever Schumann improvised, he just put the pedal down.
Right.
And
Pedal
let
to the
everything
metal.
ring over everything else. And it seems as though I think get the impression that this way of playing the guitar also is like a very natural improvisatory style.
I
Like
think
it's
so.
ideas come to you, right?
Absolutely, they
When
occur.
things are ringing and things are dying away.
Yeah.
And I was telling you just over coffee about a performance of the Goldberg Variations I heard by Joanna McGregor on the piano, where she, applying a very creative approach to playing the piece, had so much pedal down at the end of the final variation that the whole room was humming with piano resonances, and she simply put the theme into that resonance.
Inside it, like a...
Creating something, unique to the piano.
Yeah.
But in your preface to your Bach edition, you reference the Moonlight Sonata, which we believe, it looks from the score as though Bach intended it to be played that same way, with the pedal
Yeah,
down.
when Beethoven, he was referring to kind of an ancient stop that would have existed in the early pianofortes, and maybe, I don't know if the harpsichords had it too, called a celestial stop. CPE Bach talks about it, where you just pull this stop out and everything over rings, and that's how Beethoven intended that first quasi-una fantasia, that first movement, to be played with that in mind. So there's kind of a Baroque aesthetic to that harp strangeness. You have the viol d'amour, right, the violin that has the sympathetic strings built into it underneath to ring, to, in a sense, to create a kind of a space, like I call it a miniature cathedral. So if you do that on the guitar, the actual acoustical space, which the guitar is a set of strings and a little room. You look in, you've seen those pictures inside a guitar, it looks like the Sydney Opera House. This is the reality, so when you do these things, it creates a certain kind of acoustical space, and it changes the air. It gives it air. We kind of hear the air, just like when you're in a big cathedral, you hear the space, strangely. So, do you have a question? No. So you're...
Do you want to just say something about your approach to colour also? Because that cello prelude wasn't only added notes, it was also a lot of...
Yeah, I guess I just kind of hear it in terms of like that kind of dialogue, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I used to get very incensed because I was this huge Julian Bream fan, and I was like, it was like my team, Julian Bream, and I heard some people say this kind of disparaging way, it's like this ping ping woo woo thing, and I'm like, all orchestral color is kind of a dialogue, it's like woodwinds, strings, occasional brass. You know what I mean? And so when I hear like the Brandenburg concertos, sometimes they're kind of outlandish almost. When those big horns come in, you know, they're kind of crazy. But just this idea that if there's color available, by all means, use it, you know, because the guitar has this great gift. So just that kind of, when you tease out a line, instead of it just being a repetition, and you tease out I just see a triad as the same thing as one note, you know. So if there's a figure, and you can triangulate the triadic, you know, implications. They're the same thing, almost just on a physics level. You play your guitar string, and it's an E major chord, right? With these other more complex things. So to me, that's just a reality. So when I tease those out, and they dialogue with each other, change the color as you would, as you know, if you had an orchestra. In a sense, that's what I was trying for.
Does anyone have any questions? We're already all talking together.
We're talking in counterpoint.
Yeah. Anything we haven't touched on?
I would just like to thank you for your contribution with these incredibly imaginative arrangements. I find them quite inspiring.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.
And you know, you mentioned how you're used to hearing the prelude to the first cello suite playing, kind of romantically like a single line and lyrically with lots of rubato, and to cast it in such an opposite way. And it sounds so convincing to me when you line it next to the Brandenburg Concerto No. 6 or whatever, and just like, oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah, it sounded.
You heard that, and I think that's really refreshing to me.
It sounds very like when I was saying something to Stanley, and it sounds absolutely awful. Don't repeat this.
Yeah.
But he was asking like, "What are you thinking?" And he's like, "Well, I just kind of mess around with it until it kind of sounds like Bach." It's like, because it sounds like Bach in a way on those solo instruments, but not the big Bach that I fell in love with as a. I'm talking about like as a 12-year-old. I had a recording of the double violin concerto that blew my mind, you know, and then the Brandenburg concertos, and I wore that tape out, you know, as a young kid in working class Belfast, like a secret, you know, like I would get beaten up if somebody hurt me, you know, but it was like this thing that I had even before I played classical guitar. So I think that sound, just it's there, this kind of immensity, almost to do with the sublime, kind of an agoraphobia that you get at seeing a tornado, or so when I hear those big diminished chords over the tonic note, you know, that Bach does, it makes you kind of go, you know, like it's kind of like I'm small, and you sublimate into it with all the counterpoint and the fugue. It defies time, you know, it defies time and space really. And so I just want that feeling, like a heroin addict wants a feeling, you know, I just want this thing, you know. And so, yeah, that's probably at the bottom of it.
So a lot of guitarists in playing the violin and cello works are looking for a bit of a flavour, actually, of the violin or the cello, often going deliberately quite thin to try and see if it can almost, like translating a poem from Russian into English, trying to keep a little bit of a taste of Russian, say. But it sounds like what you're talking about is that the originals are already hinting at something in the opposite direction.
Absolutely. I would say that Bach is like an ambassador of the eternal, and even in his biggest works, if he had the means. When he found that Prince of Brandenburg, whoever, you know, he was like, okay, yes, please, you know. And obviously with the church, he had this certain, can't imagine how one rehearsal and then playing one of his cantatas would sound. Probably not great. But, you know, it's just immense, you know, when you listen to that 23rd cantata, you know, the one that has the you know, da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, I hear things like that, so I try and bring it, like the little idea of reducing it back into the guitar, is a little, you know, Segovia talks about. It's like a reverse cello, flauta. You know, I find that very endearing and beautiful. And when you think about the two gods of the classical guitar that the public were enamored by, Segovia and Julian Bream, what was the commonality of their playing, you know? it's color, right? It's a constant color, constant beauty and intention of sound, and not just this attempt at some sort of consistency. And that's why I like a lot of that Baroque early music world, is because it recaptures a kind of a visceral quality that maybe we've lost in some of that stuff, you know, and we can embrace the kind of the clunks and the chirps and the buzzes of the guitar, because they're in the gamba, they're in the harpsichord. It's a bit messier, it's a bit more kind of like from the gut, you know.
Do you play Baroque guitar at all?
No, I haven't even touched one, but I would mess around on if someone.
When you come to Denver, I'll sort you out.
There you go.
We're right at 7:15. We have a recital in 15 minutes. So shall we adjourn for now, and you'll be
Yep.
here the whole weekend?
Yeah, by
Thanks
all
so
means.
much, Alan. Wonderful, thank you.